December 24th, 1914. The air was thick with the biting chill of a European winter, but even colder was the grim reality of the trenches. Mud-caked and weary, the men of the opposing armies huddled in their dugouts, their breath misting in the frigid air. It was Christmas Eve, a night meant for warmth, family, and peace, but here on the Western Front, peace felt like a distant, impossible dream. Yet something extraordinary was about to happen. From the German lines, a tentative voice began to sing a carol. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. Silent night. The familiar melody, carried on the crisp night air, drifted across no man's land. A hush fell over the British trenches. Then a British voice, equally tentative, responded with the same carol in English. Soon more voices joined, a harmonious, if mournful chorus rising from the brutal landscape. It was a spontaneous, unofficial truce, born of a shared humanity that for a few precious hours transcended the horrors of war. Among the German soldiers, a young man named Karl stood, listening. He was just 19, his face still holding the softness of youth, though his eyes had seen too much. Karl wasn't a fervent ideologue, he was a conscript, a son of a baker from a small Bavarian town, thrust into a conflict he barely understood. He missed his family, the smell of his mother's baking, the sound of church bells on Sunday. The carol, sung by his enemies, stirred a profound longing in his heart. It was a fleeting moment of connection, a reminder that on the other side of this desolate field were men just like him. This Christmas truce, however, was an anomaly. The war raged on, consuming lives with relentless ferocity. Karl, like countless others, was a cog in the vast, destructive machine. He fought bravely, not out of hatred for the enemy, but out of a desperate desire to survive and to protect his comrades. He saw unspeakable things, witnessed acts of both horrifying brutality and astonishing courage. Each day chipped away at his innocence, leaving behind a harder, more world-weary soldier. Fast forward to the summer of 1918, the war was entering its final brutal phase. The Allied offensive was in full swing, and the German forces, though still fighting fiercely, were beginning to falter under the relentless pressure. Karl, now a seasoned veteran, was leading a small patrol through a shattered village, the air thick with the smell of dust and cordite. Buildings were reduced to rubble, trees to splintered stumps. It was a landscape of utter desolation. As they moved cautiously through the ruins, a sudden explosion rocked the ground. Machine gun fire erupted, pinning them down. Karl and his men scrambled for cover, returning fire as best they could. Amidst the chaos, Karl spotted a figure lying exposed in the open, not a German, but an Allied soldier, clearly wounded and struggling. The soldier was clutching his side, his face contorted in pain. He was a sitting duck, an easy target for any German soldier with a clear shot. Karl's instincts screamed at him to focus on the fight, to eliminate the threat. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the memory of the Christmas carol, or perhaps it was simply the innate human decency that still flickered within him, despite the war's best efforts to extinguish it. He saw not an enemy, but a suffering man. Ignoring the shouts of his comrades to hold his position, Karl made a split-second decision. He threw down his rifle, a gesture of peace in a world of violence, and slowly, cautiously, began to move towards the wounded soldier. His men watched in stunned silence, their weapons still hot from the skirmish. The Allied machine gun, surprisingly, had also fallen silent, perhaps out of confusion, perhaps out of a momentary flicker of shared humanity. Reaching the soldier, Karl knelt down. The man was young, barely older than Karl himself, his uniform bearing the insignia of the American Expeditionary Forces. He was bleeding profusely. Without hesitation, Karl began to administer first aid, tearing strips from his own uniform to bind the wound, using what little medical supplies he carried. He spoke in broken English, reassuring the American soldier, telling him he would be all right. As he worked, a strange sense of calm settled over Karl. In that moment, the war, the trenches, the endless killing, all faded into the background. There was only this man, his pain, and Karl's desperate attempt to alleviate it. The American soldier, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and surprise, looked at Karl, not with hatred, but with a dawning sense of understanding. Just as Karl finished bandaging the wound, a German officer arrived on the scene, drawn by the unexpected lull in the fighting. He surveyed the situation, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Karl, a German soldier tending to an American enemy. "Was ist das?" the officer demanded, his voice sharp with anger. "What is this, soldier?" Karl stood up, facing his superior. He explained simply that the American was wounded and needed help. The officer, however, was not interested in explanations. In his eyes, Karl had committed an act of treason, a betrayal of his duty. In the brutal logic of war, compassion for the enemy was a weakness, a dangerous sentiment that could undermine morale and discipline. "You have aided the enemy," the officer declared, his face contorted with cold fury. "You have compromised our position and betrayed your country." Karl tried to reason, to explain that it was simply an act of humanity, but his words fell on deaf ears. The officer saw only a violation of military protocol, a dangerous precedent. In the eyes of the military machine, Karl's act of mercy was an act of insubordination, an unforgivable offense. The consequences were swift and severe. Karl was arrested on the spot, stripped of his rank, and charged with aiding the enemy. His comrades, though some understood his actions, were powerless to intervene. The war had its own brutal laws, and mercy, especially towards the enemy, was not one of them. Karl was court-martialed. The trial was a grim affair, a mere formality. Despite his protestations that he had simply acted out of human decency, the military tribunal was unyielding. They saw his actions as a grave dereliction of duty, a dangerous example that could spread dissent and weaken the war effort. His previous bravery, his years of service, all counted for nothing against this one act of compassion. The verdict was guilty. The sentence, execution by firing squad. The news spread through his unit like wildfire. Many of his fellow soldiers were shocked, unable to reconcile the image of the brave, decent Karl they knew with the harsh sentence. They understood the brutality of war, but this felt different, crueler. A punishment for something that, in another context, would be considered a virtue. On the morning of his execution, Karl was led out to a secluded spot behind the lines. The sky was grey, a fitting backdrop for the somber occasion. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on the horizon, not on the firing squad. He had no regrets. He had saved a life, a human life, and in that moment of profound clarity, he knew it was the right thing to do. The fear was there, yes, but it was overshadowed by a quiet sense of peace. A single shot rang out, followed by a volley. Karl fell. His life, a life of duty, of forced participation in a war he didn't believe in, and ultimately of an act of profound compassion, was extinguished. He paid the ultimate price for his humanity. News of Karl's execution, though hushed and suppressed by the military, did, however, find its way to some. Among them was the American soldier Karl had saved. After recovering from his wounds, the American, whose name was Private John Smith, a common name for a common soldier, yet an extraordinary life saved, learned of the fate of his German rescuer. He was devastated. He had tried to tell his superiors about the German soldier's act of kindness, but in the chaos of war, his story was largely dismissed, seen as a battlefield hallucination or an attempt to humanize the enemy. After the war, John Smith returned home, forever changed by his experiences and forever haunted by the memory of the German soldier who saved him. He carried the scars of his physical wounds, but also the invisible scars of gratitude and guilt. He made it his mission to find out more about Karl, to ensure that his act of compassion was not forgotten. It was a difficult task, navigating through the bureaucratic maze of post-war archives and the lingering animosities. It took years, decades even, but John Smith never gave up. He spoke to historians, wrote letters, pursued every lead, no matter how faint. He wanted the world to know about the German soldier who, in the midst of unspeakable hatred, chose kindness. He wanted Karl's sacrifice to be acknowledged, not as an act of treason, but as an act of profound courage and humanity. John Smith's tireless efforts eventually bore fruit. Through painstaking research and the help of a few sympathetic historians, Karl's story slowly began to emerge from the shadows. The official military records which had condemned him were re-examined. Eyewitness accounts from his comrades, who had initially been silenced, began to surface. The truth, though slow in coming, gradually revealed itself. Karl's story became a testament to the enduring power of human compassion, even in the darkest of times. It challenged the simplistic narratives of war, the clear-cut distinctions between friend and foe. It highlighted the moral complexities faced by individuals caught in the machinery of conflict, where acts of defiance against military orders could sometimes be the most profoundly human acts of all. Karl's legacy is a powerful reminder that even amidst the horrors of war, individual acts of courage and kindness can shine through. He was not a hero in the traditional sense, not celebrated for his military prowess or his battlefield victories. His heroism lay in his refusal to succumb to the dehumanizing forces of war, in his unwavering commitment to his fellow man, regardless of uniform or nationality. Today, Karl's story serves as a poignant counter-narrative to the often glorified accounts of warfare. It reminds us that behind every uniform, every battle, every statistic, there are individuals with their own stories, their own moral compasses, their own capacity for both immense cruelty and extraordinary compassion. Karl, the baker's son from Bavaria, who saved an American soldier and paid the ultimate price, stands as a quiet but powerful symbol of the enduring hope for humanity in the face of unimaginable adversity. His story, once silenced by the very institutions he served, now speaks volumes about the true cost of war and the enduring power of empathy. His life, though tragically cut short, continues to inspire, reminding us that even in the most brutal of conflicts, the light of human kindness can never be entirely extinguished. The world remembers those who fought and those who fell, but sometimes it's the quiet acts of defiance, the moments when humanity triumphs over hatred, that resonate the loudest across the decades. Karl's story is one such echo, a whisper of hope from the fields of despair.